Fire, in war, was never about comfort. It was a calculation. If you stay with me for the next minute, you'll understand why a fragment of steel no larger than your thumb quietly became one of the most reliable survival tools in the coldest campaigns of the Second World War, not because it was designed that way, but because men under pressure learned to bend reality in their favor. In the Ardennes, during the winter of 1944, temperatures plunged so low that weapons jammed and skin froze to metal. Soldiers didn't fear the enemy as much as they feared the slow shutdown of their own bodies. When your hands stop working, when your core temperature drops, when your mind begins to dull, you are no longer a combatant, you're a casualty waiting to happen. And in that moment, the difference between life and death often came down to whether you could create a few seconds of heat. Not a fire to sit beside, not a flame to admire, but a controlled ignition, small, deliberate, and efficient. That's where this story begins. The reality of winter warfare forced soldiers to rethink everything they knew about fire. Modern survival advice often assumes calm conditions and prepared minds. That illusion collapses the moment you step into the historical reality of winter warfare. Soldiers on the Eastern Front and in the forests of Belgium were not operating with clarity or patience. They were exhausted, underfed, sleep-deprived, and often injured. Their environment worked against them at every level. Snow didn't just cover the ground, it saturated materials. Wood was damp. Matches failed. Fingers lost dexterity. Even something as simple as striking a flame became a task that required coordination many no longer had. Accounts from veterans across multiple fronts repeat the same pattern. Attempts to start fires failed more often than they succeeded. Damp tinder refused to catch. Wind stole heat faster than it could build. And every failed attempt carried a cost. The body burns calories rapidly in cold conditions, and each movement, each breath, each second spent trying and failing drained what little energy remained. Fire in this context was not a convenience. It was a biological necessity, as critical as stopping bleeding or maintaining circulation. Survival under pressure depended on using what was already available. Unlike modern survivalists, soldiers did not carry specialized equipment for wilderness conditions. Their gear was dictated by military necessity, not environmental preparedness. Ammunition, rations, basic tools, and personal items made up the entirety of what they had. There were no ferro rods, no waterproof matches sealed in plastic, no curated kits designed for emergencies. Everything had to serve multiple purposes, whether it was intended to or not. This constraint forced a shift in thinking. Survival became less about having the right tool and more about redefining the tools already in hand. Helmets became wind barriers. Mess tins became heat reflectors. Bayonets doubled as structural supports or digging implements. And among these repurposed objects, one stood out, not because it was obvious, but because it was universal. Every soldier carried a razor blade. It existed for grooming, nothing more. But in the cold, its purpose evolved. Soldiers began to see it not as a blade, but as a surface. A medium. Something that could interact with heat in a way other materials could not. The properties of thin steel made it uniquely suited for ignition. To understand why the razor blade became so effective, you have to look at its physical characteristics. It was thin, extremely thin, meaning it required very little energy to heat up. It was made of carbon steel, which responds quickly to sparks and retains heat just long enough to transfer it. And most importantly, it had minimal mass. That meant energy was not wasted heating excess material. Every spark that landed on it had a measurable effect. Compare that to thicker metal objects. A helmet or a bayonet absorbs heat, but it takes far longer to reach a usable temperature. In freezing conditions, that delay can mean failure. Wood, on the other hand, burns but does not conduct heat efficiently. Fabric ignites quickly, but cannot sustain or transfer heat in a controlled way. The razor blade occupied a narrow but critical middle ground. It didn't burn, but it didn't resist heat either. It accepted energy, held it briefly, and passed it along. That made it ideal as a bridge between spark and flame. The method worked because it concentrated heat where it mattered most. What soldiers discovered was not a trick in the modern sense. It was a repeatable interaction between materials. When the blade was placed on a stable surface and sparks were directed onto it, something important happened. Instead of scattering and dying, the sparks accumulated, the steel warmed. And when even marginal tinder, lint, scraped wood, frayed cloth, was placed in contact with that warmed surface, it began to transition. Not instantly, not dramatically, but predictably. The key was control. Rather than trying to ignite tinder in open air, where wind and cold dissipated heat, the blade created a localized zone where energy could build. Breath was used carefully, not as a gust, but as a steady flow, guiding oxygen without extinguishing the fragile reaction. Within seconds, smoke would appear. Then a glow. From that glow, a flame, small, but sufficient. This was not about creating a fire to last the night. It was about achieving ignition with the highest possible probability under the worst possible conditions. World War II fire strategy prioritized discretion and efficiency over size. One of the most misunderstood aspects of wartime survival is the nature of fire itself. Large flames were dangerous. They revealed position, attracted attention, and could invite deadly consequences. Soldiers were not trying to build campfires or trying to create microfires. Brief, contained sources of heat that served a specific purpose. A few moments of warmth could restore circulation to fingers. It could dry a piece of fabric. It could raise core temperature just enough to prevent collapse. And then it would be extinguished. This was not optional. It was doctrine born from necessity, even if it was never formally written. The razor blade method fit seamlessly into this philosophy. It enabled quick ignition without requiring large amounts of fuel or extended exposure. It supported the idea that survival depended not on abundance, but on precision. Repeated patterns across different fronts suggest this was not isolated knowledge. What makes this method particularly compelling is not its elegance, but its recurrence. Across memoirs from German, American, and other Allied soldiers, similar descriptions appear. Sparks being caught on metal, small pieces of steel used to assist ignition, heat being concentrated rather than dispersed. These accounts are rarely detailed. They are mentioned in passing, often without explanation, but the consistency is striking. Men in entirely different regions, facing similar conditions, arrived at the same solution independently. That tells us something important. This was not a formal technique passed down through training. It was a natural response to a shared problem. When faced with extreme cold and limited resources, human beings converged on the same practical answer. The broader principle behind the method reflects a deeper survival mindset. At its core, this is not a story about a razor blade. It is a story about thermal efficiency. Every action taken by soldiers in winter conditions was guided by a single principle: conserve heat, and when necessary, generate it with minimal loss. They insulated rather than exposed. They sheltered rather than expanded. They used small, controlled interventions instead of large, wasteful efforts. Fire was part of that system, but it was not the centerpiece. It was one tool among many, used sparingly and with intent. The razor blade exemplified this approach. It did not create heat, it directed it. It ensured that whatever energy was available was used where it would have the greatest effect. Modern reliance on convenience has obscured these lessons. Today, access to technology has fundamentally changed how people approach cold environments. Heating systems, fuel sources, and manufactured tools provide layers of security that did not exist during the war. But that security comes with a cost. When those systems fail, many find themselves unprepared. Power outages during winter storms reveal this gap quickly. Without electricity, central heating stops. Without fuel, portable heaters become useless. And without a foundational understanding of how heat works, people struggle to adapt. The contrast with wartime soldiers is stark. They operated without safety nets. Their survival depended entirely on their ability to interpret their environment and use what they had. That mindset, flexible, observant, and grounded in physical reality, is what made methods like the razor blade possible. The real takeaway is not the tool, but the way of thinking behind it. There is no need to carry a razor blade for survival. The object itself is not the lesson. What matters is the principle it represents. Thin materials heat quickly. Concentrated energy is more effective than dispersed energy. Controlled environments improve outcomes. These are universal truths, applicable far beyond the battlefield. In a modern context, this could mean using a piece of metal from a vehicle, a tool from a kit, or any object that shares similar properties. The specifics will vary. The physics will not. Understanding how to create and manage small amounts of heat can transform a situation. It turns a failing lighter into a usable spark source. It turns marginal materials into viable tinder. It shifts survival from chance to intention. Quiet, unrecorded knowledge often has the greatest impact. History tends to highlight large-scale events, battles, strategies, decisions made by leaders. But survival is built on smaller moments, individual choices, observations made under pressure, adjustments that are never documented but are repeated because they work. The razor blade method exists in that space. It was never formalized, it was never taught in manuals. And yet, it persisted, because it solved a problem in a way that was efficient, reliable, and accessible. That is the kind of knowledge that endures. It's not because it is celebrated, but because it is useful. The final question is what knowledge you carry when systems fail. Strip away modern conveniences, and the underlying challenges remain the same. Cold affects the body in predictable ways. Heat behaves according to fixed principles. Materials respond based on their properties. If those systems you rely on were gone, what would you fall back on? It's not tools, not equipment, but understanding. Because in the end, that is what sustains soldiers through the harshest winters of the 20th century. If this kind of deep, practical history matters to you, if you want more insights that bridge past and present in ways that actually prepare you, subscribe to the channel and share this with someone who takes survival seriously.